All right, guys, since you have started the webinar, I've started recording and we are ready to go. Attendees should start trickling in any minute now.
Great.
All right, let me stop share.
Shall we go? Yeah, I'm sharing. It's okay, yeah?
Yep.
Good. So then I'll stop sharing. Okay. Good.
Whoa, can you see this?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay,
Okay, so we're ready.
great.
Okay. Okay.
Ron, how do you want to do the discussions? Do you want to do it immediately after the paper or?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So people remember, what we're talking about. So I was thinking 20 and 5 and 20 and 5. We just go through in the order of that were listed.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like we have a few people here.
Good.
I'm going to look and. Panelists 5. Okay, it won't let me. Okay. I guess it doesn't look at the participants, but that's okay. Let me see.
I think the only way we're going to be able to communicate with people is through the Q&A.
Yeah, I think you're right. Q&A, let's see what we got here. Robert McKee. Okay. Okay. I guess we're about to start here. I'll pull up my screen share. My PowerPoint. Let's see, is that the right one? No, wait. This was the right one. Okay. We'll give it a minute or two here.
Ron, I've been wondering who is in the portrait behind you.
Oh, that is my wife's great grandfather. Who was a minister in Indiana, apparently, in down way south, down by the Ohio River. Yeah, so Evansville, I believe. Yeah, I don't. But the Reverend Darby. We just, I don't know. We got that portrait.
It's a good one.
Been sitting up there for a while. Yeah, thank you. Okay, well let me start. So we have fairly strict time limits here. So I'm going to set my watch here. So my presentation, I know the title differs from what I originally submitted as a proposal. I'll try to link it a little bit to the coronavirus, but I think like many of our proposals, things have moved on, and this one I got back to the climate crisis that I think is actually we're going to be facing right away. So I'm going to start here. This is my I'm sorry. This is my my paper and not my. Here we go. This says PD. Here we go. This is the one I want. Sorry. Okay, so let me It's not letting me page down here. Oh, okay, here we go. Let me do it this way. So, so my first point is that, you know, obviously Biden has built this campaign around the slogan "Build Back Better," but it's not really, we can't really do that because we face an urgent climate crisis. And part of what the first major point I'm going to make is that the Arctic sea ice melt is imminent. It's really going to happen 5-10 years. I mean, it's very, very close. I'll show you the graphs of where the sea ice is. And we need to do triage for that. If we don't, we're going to have a really jump in warming that could potentially be catastrophic. So, and the second point I'm going to make is that much of the standard kind of dialogue about the Green New Deal, I think, is not enough. We really have to talk about pulling carbon out. I mean, even the IPCC in their latest report has acknowledged this. And that's going to have to be a major part of this and an important part of this. And we should be right now working on that. And that leads to a third point, which is that there's an overriding economic way of thinking about this, about closing the carbon cycle. That is, we put the carbon up in the air, we need to bring it down and use it and sequester it. And by closing the carbon cycle, actually building things out of this carbon, or, you know, it doesn't even have to be pure carbon. We can build it back through biological methods, use the biology to bring down the carbon, you know, partial use of nature still. We can actually create an economy that is a complete circle economy that both, you know, oxidizes and then brings the carbon back down and uses it to produce things, as we'll see, as I'll show in the slides, I hope, that will allow us to actually reduce our dependence on predatory, you know, searching on sort of an economy where we're looking for, we're limited by natural resources, by gas and by oil and by other natural resources. We can substitute carbon for many of those and actually have greater abundance, greater potential to grow for humanity as a whole, and be less of a rentier economy, less dependent on what you find in the ground in any particular place. So let me, that's the general overview. I'll try and go quickly through these slides. I know I have you know, quite a few here, so I'm not going to read through all of them. This one, so I mentioned these points here. This is a stock problem, not a flow problem. So this idea that by reducing our emissions, we're somehow going to get out of this, that's just, it's completely unrealistic. I mean, we need to think of it as we filled up our dump site, which has been the atmosphere and the oceans. There's about a 10-year lag between the two of them. And we need to get the carbon out of both. The other point, you know, another important point here is that we can't really wait for a fundamental social transformation. So as much as I, as a, you know, committed leftist, I mean, I've been, you know, a democratic socialist for, I don't know, what is it, 40 years or 50 years now, revealing, no, not 50, but that, you know, I would love to have a major transformation, and we certainly need to build as much equity and, you know, build these plants where we need jobs, and you know, reduce environmental impact on frontline communities, and you know, where we've been putting most of that impact up till now. So environmental justice considerations should be front and center, but we can't wait for the transformation. And so in some ways, the framing that of the left is, I'll get to that slide in a second, but it's become a bit of an obstacle, I think, in that framing that as a moral political issue may be, I mean, maybe not as constructive right now as framing as a practical problem of waste management and reuse of that carbon. So here's the slide I wanted to show. we've done all these things where, many countries are actually much farther ahead than we are in terms of renewable energy, changing their transportation systems, et cetera. But that's not going to get us there. And one of the reasons, of course, is that many countries in the world are dependent. We're dependent 90% or so of our energies from fossil fuels, and where many countries have no other choice, especially developing countries where oftentimes they're state-owned or companies that are running the fossil fuel extraction and export. They can't shift immediately to some other kind of economy. So what do we do? Here's the point I was just making. I encourage people to read the slides, when there's more time for that. This is the point I just made. What we have to do are two things, as I said before. We have to deal with the Arctic sea ice melt. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about this, and I know my fellow colleagues, economists, say, well, we'll just leave that to scientists. The problem is the scientists are all very aware of this. They've been talking about with each other in increasing levels of alarm. And frankly, many people in the country, just kind of given up. Like, I can't think about this. This is just too horrendous to think about, and it's not getting out to the public. So I think it's really important that people like myself, who I'm an economist, obviously not a natural scientist. My daughter is studying climate science, but that doesn't give me any particular expertise. We need to be aware of what's going on, and the Arctic sea ice is not an issue of sea level rise. That's more tied to the greenhouse ice sheet and larger ice sheets. The problem is that the Arctic reflects the sun. The ice reflects the sun. When that ice goes, the albedo effect, the reflection, disappears. And there have been numerous estimates of what that would be, and it's somewhere in the range of 70, about a half a. It's a half a watt of radiative forcing, but the key thing it's over 17 years of global warming in one shot if you take it from the 2016 levels. So and that's just for that albedo effect. The other effects, the Arctic amplification, that the problem is what happens in the Arctic affects the entire global climate. It affects the jet stream, it affects the ocean current, and it could lead to immediate, it could lead to the permafrost melting and methane under the permafrost leaking, and really, catastrophic impact if we just let this happen. So the issue is not, we don't want to interfere with the global climate. We are already, and we're having this is the first tipping point. It's been widely recognized as the first tipping point. We're about to go over it. Here's the graphs. This is where we are right now. So you can see, 225, depending on how you do the estimate here. I have different fits here, exponential Gompertz log fit. You get 225 to about 240 if this trend continues. And we're at a point where the ice is so thin. I mean, this just looks at volume, the surface area. But if you look at the permanent ice has basically disappeared from the Arctic, is my understanding. It's basically 1 year ice. It's very thin. We're at a critical point. This is what happens. So this is September. That's the minimum ice month in the Arctic. This is the other months. So you see, once September happens, and pretty soon thereafter, the sea ice goes. The summers, the sea ice. The summer sea ice will disappear first, of course, and then all the ice. What do we do with this? Now, again, this is for climate scientists to determine, but there are numerous proposals. They're not that costly. Stratospheric aerosol injection is 5 billion. That's 10 billion is the most big. This one would, you take here. I have some of the details here. Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. When the volcanoes erupt, they put sulfur up in the stratosphere when there are large eruptions. This cooled the planet for about 0.6 Celsius for 15 months. So there's an effort by, there's a proposal to do that by 120,000 flights, of the building a fleet of about 100 planes that could do this. And to have the same impact. There's other methods of putting iron, little bits of iron in the ships that sail around the Arctic, and that would similarly, although at lower cloud levels, create more cloud density and prevent this albedo effect, this reduction in sun reflection from occurring. So that I think, we need to get on this right away. Where I think Gates is funding one program. The guy who's doing the SAI is David Keith. He's a professor of physics at Harvard. He's been on this for a while to sort of pilot, measure what's going on. And the critiques have been, well, that's going to affect the ozone layer. So let's measure it. Let's determine. He says if we use calcium, we could actually improve the ozone layer. Calcium instead of sulfite. So let's see what works, and maybe we want to do a local thing. The advantage of this is it would also have a universal, uniform effect around the globe and reduce the effect of the climate temporarily. It's not a solution. Nobody's saying this is a solution. We've got to deal with the greenhouse gas emissions for a real solution, but it will give us some more time and prevent this tipping point from occurring. Okay, my next point, major point, the carbon cycle restoration through carbon direct removal and carbon sequestration and use. I think I got my alphabet there a little bit off. So there are numerous ways to do this. I don't have time to go through all of them. I will just highlight some of the key ways. I have a bunch of tables here. You can either do it from the ocean using biology. You can do it from the using chemicals from the ocean, like iron fertilization, which increases plankton growth and then fish, and then some of that drops down to the bottom and then also increases fertility. You can do it air capture using biology with pasturing and agriculture, as many of the cap and trade in California actually has that as one of their protocols, some of these things. And then air capture from the air using chemical processes. And these are usually industrial processes. There's point source capture from flues, and there's also direct air capture from the ambient air. And some of the more interesting methods are using carbon in concrete. Building materials about a third. It's about 35 gigatons of all the materials that reproduce as humans. That includes food, fuel, building materials, and there's one other category that I forget. But anyway, about a third of that is building materials, and about 2/3 of that is actually concrete. It's the most widely used substance in the world. 2/3. So we could go a long way by substituting carbon negative concrete, as you suck the carbon out, you use it to produce the limestone and the calcium for the concrete. And there are companies doing that. They put a piece in the San Francisco airport, Blue Planet. There's a bunch of companies doing this. So this is very much possible. Ocean iron fertilization, I kind of mentioned that. Point source air capture, there's a company called Global Thermostat that's been working with Exxon. And this is another thing. I mean, the fossil fuel companies were terrible. Yes, they promoted false information, hid what they knew about this for years and years, and they are culpable for a lot of that. But we're going to have to build on their infrastructure. I think, following my earlier point, we can't just rebuild our infrastructure in 10 years or 20 years. We've got to build on what we have. So there's a couple of people, Peter Eisenberger and Gabriela Chicholinsky. The latter is an economist actually at Columbia, and the former is a physicist, material scientist. They've teamed together, co-founded a company called Global Thermostat that's actually working with Exxon and doing this point capture using natural gas plants. So the idea here is to use a natural gas plant, the heat from the natural gas, you use that as energy to remove the carbon. They're working right now for a 50,000 ton CO2 a year plant. They want to get up to megatonnage, but this is the way to get to scale. For scale, the average, say, I think it's a hectare, an acre of, say, buffalo grass is 140 tons of CO2 a year. So these industrial methods are, you know, thousands of times faster than biological methods for removing carbon. Now, then you have to do something with it. Obviously, the tree puts it in the ground, but here we put it in a tank, and you got to do something with it or sequester it. There's ways of injecting it in basalt. A company in Switzerland has done that. Basalt is widely available, and that will mineralize it. You can use it for injected in oil wells and saline aquifers. There are various ways of getting rid of it. This is another really interesting method. It's ambient capturing from the ambient air. That's Klaus Lackner, a physicist at Arizona State. He was originally at Columbia at the Earth Institute where the other people were. So all these people kind of know each other. Klaus has developed a mechanical tree that sucks carbon about 1,000 times faster. He's got a plant, a company in Ireland, Silicon Kingdom, working on that, and they're going to build a pilot in California. 120,000 trees can get 4 million tons, so you need about, and they're only about, a farm is about an acre, so the land use goes away, the land use issue, and he's using dryness to, so he has it's a very, very ingenious method of using wind and dryness in the cycle between moisture and dryness to remove the carbon. The last, okay, so we can sequester it, we can use it. I mentioned some of this. And now one of the Peter Eisenberger in particular and Gabriella have, I think it's Eisenberger, has come up with the idea of the renewable renewable energy and materials economy, the REMI economy that I talked about, to move us from hunter-gatherer industrial civilization to a more complete, this is human-designed carbon renewable, I forget the acronym here, but it's a human-designed economy to become a cultivator carbon civilization instead of a hunter-gatherer carbon civilization that we are right now. I find this extremely interesting, extremely exciting. It is of course, you know, somewhat up. I doubt we'll be able, we need to pull down about 1,500 or 1,700 gigatons of carbon to get us back to climate stability. We can't do that by cement or other options for reuse. So we're going to have to sequester a lot of this. So that goes back to Klaus Lackner's vision of waste management problem. But I think Peter is onto something, and a lot of, if any of you want to, you know, you go onto Air Miners or all these people are just coming up with thousands of ideas to do stuff with this carbon. One of the, finally, let me, you know, graphene using carbon substitutes for aluminum and steel is another one besides the concrete. Let me finally get to policy. I have a few points here, 1 and 2. We need a cap and trade. Robin Hennell, who's an URPE guy, has done a lot of work on this, points out that cap and trade is actually very useful if it's done correctly. You need the countries to be the monitors. Doesn't matter if they're bogus certificates or not. If companies are limited, you know, you can measure that pretty carefully and keep a tab on that. And it would be up to the countries themselves to monitor how accurate these removal methods are. But you need more than that. In line with what I was saying, you need a zero cap. You need sources of funding for carbon drawdown, for triage, and you need actually what we need to work on is putting in requirements in public and private governments and local governments, state governments for carbon negative building material and carbon negative fuel and all these other things to get this moving, because then you could get the sequestering and recycling going. So I think that ambient air capturing would be the what people would have to pay. So that would force fossil fuel companies and others to get on with it and find ways to capture their point source carbon, which should be cheaper than ambient air. So you create a floor. You know, this is the price for getting rid of carbon would be ambient air capture, and I think that's a very good point. So this is not a replacement for the Green New Deal. It's an enhancement. It's an expansion. It's what we need to do to get this moving along. Okay, thank you. I think I've finished my time, and I will stop. and ask, stop share, and ask Bob to comment on this for about 5 minutes or so.
Thanks, Ron. I can't say I enjoy this paper, in part because I think I'm one of those who has tended to compartmentalize climate disruption as being too hard to think about. But I did find it interesting and informative and provocative. So I do think it's an important paper. You're raising some really important issues. I think I'll just go through, given time, some of what I see as the key contributions and some of the suggestions in terms of how you might continue to work on it. I think one of the main contributions is the way you reframe the problem. From looking at this solely as a flow mitigation problem into looking at it as a stock capacity problem. And I think that's it's something I hadn't thought about, and I think it's really important. And it seems to me that you have two major arguments for why that's really critical that we look at it, we reframe it this way. One is you're saying is that the Arctic sea ice problem is we just can't wait. And so we can't just reduce our carbon emissions fast enough to even begin to be able to address this issue. And so what part of it is that provides a deadline. The second thing is, I think, if I understood your argument, is that you're arguing that even zero emissions at some level is a false goal. It's sort of a purist goal, I think you referred to it, and that does not necessarily make good policy sense. You might want to elaborate more on why that's the case. It sounds like you're arguing that there's always going to likely to be some high value use of fossil fuels into the future, and so having zero emissions can be problematic. I mean, again, this is sort of a classic way in which economists think about things differently than, say, scientists. Okay, perhaps. So that's I think that's really important. You offer a whole bunch of strategies and technologies on how to mitigate the declining Arctic sea ice, which I think is really important. And then also you offer quite a few strategies on how to both deal with the carbon reduction, both in terms of supplementing natural processes, which I think is really important, as well as sequestering it into the ground or into other reservoirs. You give lots of numbers and estimates, and they're and you use lots of different metrics. So if there's a way in which you can help the reader sort of understand if it's going to solve the problem or pull them, what degree of the problem are we solving? It would be helpful if there was some way in which you could guide a reader who may not know exactly what all these metrics and what the scale of the problem is, how they do it. So again, all of those are I think are important. Some things I would encourage you to address is that so you talk about solutions to the sea ice, and that's really about temperature, lowering the global temperatures to try to reduce the heat in terms of the melt of the sea ice. And then the second part of the paper, you talk about carbon. So I found that confusing, trying to figure out how you were getting one and then the other and so forth. So just a little bit more guidance for the reader in terms of looking at that the solutions are quite different in what you're trying to do. So ultimately, you're going to be talking about carbon, but in the intermediate step, you're talking about solutions to lower just temperatures as your triage treatment. I think, as you did in the presentation, it would be helpful if you highlight key solutions. You sort of throw the reader in this paper into these tables, and it's hard to know what I'm supposed to look at, what I'm supposed to absorb, And so part of it is then I'm just going to avoid it. Okay, so I think it's helpful to have that table, but then to sort of highlight some of the key strategies that you think are most important or most illustrative of what you're trying to do. You refer a lot in the paper to the global Green New Deal.
We're at zero time, but
Okay.
go ahead.
So just if you would elaborate on that. Okay.
Yes.
In
Thank
terms
you.
of what that is, it a vision, is it a policy, whatever. But that's, again, I really appreciate the paper, and it's important stuff. So well done.
Thank you. Okay, so we will move on to Sergio's presentation.
Hello, everyone. I will share my screen. Okay, so my talk today is about Martian analysis of the cyclical, structural, and systemic dimensions of the COVID crisis. The purpose of the paper is to analyze the COVID crisis from a Marxist standpoint. My presentation today is going to be mostly discursive. I was thinking when I proposed the abstract, I was thinking more in a presentation based on empirical evidence, but I was not able to update my databases and so on. So I decided to drop all the empirical stuff of my presentation and exclusively center in a discursive line of argument. And my basic theoretical proposition is that a proper analysis of the crisis must include three main dimensions of the crisis and its interconnections. That these are the cyclical dimension, the structural, and the systemic dimensions. I think these are three very important and different dimensions of the COVID crisis that should be addressed. In the cyclical perspective, first, what I want to emphasize is that it is actually a very atypical crisis, the COVID crisis. To be true, at the brink of 2020, the world economy was on the verge of falling into a new cyclical crisis. However, it did not happen or it happened for the COVID, but not for the COVID-19, but not for other reasons that could happen. No, this situation have surprisingly been averted in previous years, despite various warning signs. And eventually, none of the imbalances accumulated after the end of the 2007-2009 cyclical crisis ended up acting as the main trigger of the crisis. Instead, the cyclical trigger of the crisis was the outbreak and the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic and the consequent need to impose extreme measures of containment and health mitigations to face the COVID-19 pandemic. And although the crisis is ongoing, it's cyclically characterized by an unprecedented contraction, 2 quarters of 2 quarters duration in the US, but of a huge size, and a quick recovery, 1 quarter by now in the US. This recovery is also partial by now, hasn't recovered the activity levels before the crisis, but is also unprecedented in terms of comparison with other cyclical crises in the US recent history, at least, now, or in the last century's history, last few centuries history. And this atypical nature of the crisis implies a challenge for the assessment of the crisis, its development and its consequence. It's actually a challenge for its future forecast, how the crisis is going to develop in the next few months or few quarters, and it's also difficult to analyze because of this. Actually, the ability of the economies to resume normal economic activity depends on the evolution of the pandemic. which in turn depends now on the speed and success of the vaccination campaigns that are already going on, and the profound and enduring effects of the crisis will depend on the evolution of the pandemic, but also on the structural context in which the cyclical crisis took place. So I moved to the structural dimension of the crisis. Oh yeah, and here what I want to emphasize is that the antecedent of the crisis is the 2007-2009 Great Recession. This recession was a structural crisis that exposed the contradictions of the neoliberal capitalism. Was also a very deep and profound crisis. I characterize it as a financial structural crisis. But however, deep structural transformations of the economy were averted by a massive public intervention in the economy, led it by an unprecedented unconventional monetary policy, among other. The consequence was prolonged stagnated growth, permanent deflationary pressures, and an elevated macroeconomic instability that has characterized the world economy in the 2010s after the crisis. And actually the economic intervention was still present and strong when the COVID-19 crisis started. So the scope of the fiscal and monetary policies were consequently jeopardized. I think that the room for addressing the crisis through economic policy was smaller, or than it would normally have been. Other consequences. And the second aspect I want to emphasize about the structural dimension of the crisis is that when the COVID crisis took place, started, we were in a dire structural context. First, the economic contradictions that led to the Great Recession were not suppressed, have accumulated since the Great Recession, and the current structural risk include first, maximum levels of accumulation of debt in the world economy, continued financial hegemony and the risk associated to it. For example, the creation of new speculative bubbles in the stock and other financial markets. And I think here the stock market is very important as an example of these new bubbles. It's been growing heavily in the last months during the pandemic in a very maybe surprising movement or situation. And fourth, another current structural risk is the tendency to deglobalization and the trade wars already happening, and also the potential new trade wars, as well as an overall hegemonic dispute that could be very dangerous for the world economy. And finally, anyhow, neoliberalism and financial hegemony as two main aspects of capitalism in the last decades and still today are still very strong, as it's evident in the increase in inequality during the COVID-19 crisis and the class bias of the anti-cyclical economic programs that have been taking place during the COVID-19 crisis. And finally, I would like to address the systemic dimension of the crisis. And first going to emphasize the inability to deal with the catastrophic mortality. The COVID-19 pandemic is the first global situation of catastrophic mortality of the humanity since World War II, and the first pandemic since the Spanish influenza of 1918. It's been many decades since then, and I mean, the world has changed a lot, the capitalism has evolved a lot, but I think that we are less prepared for a massive intervention in order to deal with these situations that we were then. To me, the main factor contributing to the inability to deal with the pandemic has been the deterioration of the state, especially during the neoliberalism. The state has changed to be a very strong state and a very authoritarian state, but especially to repress the population, to impose the capitalist agenda, but it's a very weak state in order to deal with these overall human needs that have been posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now the state is limited to intervene drastically in a coordinated way in the economy and the society as is needed. And at the beginning of the pandemic, the term war economy was evoked, but I think the measures taken were far from what a war economy is supposed to be. Instead of huge planification and a huge state intervention, what we have had is a rather chaotic kind of kill or be killed economy, or such a thing like that. Yeah, and this has been capitalism and neoliberal capitalism has failed to address properly the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, the development and deployment of the vaccines are a clear example of the limited role of the state. Although the state has contributed financially to some vaccines, these are now monopolized by the pharmaceutical companies in its production and distribution. There is now one vaccine that has already been approved by many governments in the world, and it's been applied by many governments in the world. That is the Pfizer vaccine, but this is only produced by Pfizer in their facilities, and it's only distributed by Pfizer in these facilities, and all the potential facilities that could produce the vaccine are not used because the vaccine is owned by Pfizer, and this is an obstacle to the vaccine implementation in a massive manner. And another example is what for example, in Europe, they are having issues to apply the vaccine because they don't have enough people, enough medical personnel in order to apply the vaccines nowadays, and this is amazing. And finally, of course, the deterioration of the health systems, public health systems in some countries, or health systems in other places, especially during private health systems in other places, especially during neoliberalism, has contributed to the inability to provide adequate health care and prevention. And this is especially true in many countries in the world, but in developed countries in the core economies of Europe and in the US, care and prevention of the population. This could be thought in peripheral economies, but the scenes that we have seen during the pandemic in core economy, and probably wouldn't have thought that this could happen before the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the systematic dimension, and I'm finishing with it. There is an inability to deal with the causes of the pandemic too. Because the pandemic, the spontaneous generation of the virus or the new coronavirus, and the climate crisis, and the accelerated destruction of the nature. Viruses are passing from people to animals and from animals to people in much faster way now than in the past history, because of our use of nature. But however, the measures taken to deal with this crisis, we think capitalism have proven ineffective, at least by now. And finally, the crisis has shown the inability of capitalism to meet human needs, but basic human needs, that as these needs that were that arose during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent crisis have evidenced further the growing inability of capitalism to meet human needs, but it has also revealed the accumulated capacity developed by humans, as shown, for example, by the quick development of vaccines for the new coronavirus, and the difficult task of liberating this capacity and humans themselves from the yoke of capitalism, more needed than ever, though most probably not near now than in some other situations in the past. So I'm finishing here my presentation. I only want to apologize that I did not send it in advance the presentation to Neil. So his comments will only be based on my presentation today. So I'm sorry for this, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergio. And you finished ahead of your time. So Neil, if you want to make some comments, as Sergio said, you know, whatever you can can do would be much appreciated.
For sure. I just start off by thank you for the presentation, and talk about some of the things that you brought up that I particularly liked. I like the way you structured your analysis, talking about these three dimensions, and then particularly the interconnections between the cyclical, structural, and systemic sort of dimensions of this challenge. When you're talking about the cyclical nature of crises in capitalism, I particularly appreciated that. That in our present state, and maybe I'm just talking about myself here, there's sort of this, before COVID is, well, that was just another time, but actually placing the crisis within the larger sort of evolving, you know, history of capitalism is important and welcome to see. And that there was another crisis sort of going on when this new crisis began. You know, I would call that a joke if it didn't make me want to cry, right? With a similar sort of expansion on that, when you talk about the atypical nature of this crisis, the particular way that this is embedded in something else, right? And that the COVID crisis, in the sort of death throes of neoliberalism, perhaps, right, makes the forecasting particularly difficult, right? And then when you go and you talk about the structural elements of this, I think are really interesting. That my sort of training in MMT makes me sort of bristle at the idea that we've reached some sort of maximum debt capacity or something like this, right? As the crisis has unfolded, countries around the world have just, pushed massive amounts of money into the economy. But that does not mean, right, that willingness to push money and to address the problems of capitalism, the problems of people's lives will continue in the future. I could imagine there being a recourse to say, well, COVID's over, now everybody has to kind of pick up the problems for themselves. Tying back to Ron's presentation a second ago, I can really see them conversation being, well, we can't address global climate change because we just spent all the money, right? Unfortunately, and that's what I imagine to be the most likely outcome. When you're talking about the systemic dimensions of this, one of the things that I really liked was your discussion of the contrast between the strong and the weak state, right? That states in some ways have never been stronger, and at the same time, the weakness of the state has never been clearer. And that dichotomy, I thought, was really was rich. And then finally, when you close with this discussion of another contrast between the tremendous human ingenuity that we can, and I say we in the broadest sense, right? That we can create vaccines for influenza, something that we've never really been able to do effectively before. Produce billions of doses, hopefully, right? But at the same time, capitalism as a system isn't able to actually address basic human needs. And so that contrast is overwhelming to me, and overwhelming, not surprising, but overwhelming in a way that perhaps mirrors things like the climate crisis. So I'll yield my balance if you want to answer questions from the chat or something like that. Thanks again for your presentation.
Thank you, Neil. Excellent. That gets us. So let's move on now to Bob's paper.
Thank you, Ron, for sharing this and putting this session together. As you all heard, this is I'm really pleased to be a part of this session. There's some really provocative work that's being done, and I'm glad to be able to be part of it. What I'll be looking at today is I'm going to be having a little more provincial. I'll be looking at the United States as opposed to more global issues that my colleagues have been focused on, and looking at. I think we're all aware that the course that we're on is going to bring more COVID. You mentioned that, the rampant capitalism.
Bob, I think you need to speak up a little bit. Your voice is it's not coming through.
Thank you. All right, I'll speak up. Usually not a problem for me, but let me know. What my paper is going to be looking at is the course that we're on. I think would be the best argument for why we need to implement the Green New Deal and much, much more. And so I agree with my colleagues that this would be just a down payment on where we need to go. So obviously we're aware of many of the current circumstances. We're facing a winter, a very grim winter. It doesn't have to be this way. In terms of the United States, there's almost 15 million who have lost hours or jobs. We have 18 million households that are behind in their rent and mortgage payments with back payments. All of this is happening despite the fact that the U.S. government has implemented over the last generations a wealth policy that could have forestalled all this. But because of its design towards helping those that are affluent, it has not done so. So we are seeing a environmental crisis as well as a social equity crisis going on. I think that the wisdom of the Green New Deal is it recognizes the twin threats to our economic security, both the trying to mitigate the effects of climate disruption, as modest as they may be, as well as redressing the harm created by widening economic inequality. I would argue both of these are existential threats to our society and to our economy, and that we need to work on both of these simultaneously. And I appreciate Ron's point in terms of looking at mitigating climate disruption by also making sure that we're paying attention to equity concerns. What I think we are on right now is what I call the gilded raw deal. And that is misguided Trump administration policies in terms of the Paris Accord, renewed emphasis on coal and fossil fuel extraction, and in addition, misguided federal wealth policies that far precede what the Trump administration has done. And that's what will be the focus of my paper is how we have our policies have been incredibly misguided and have left households largely unprotected. I will say this, and I may take a little issue with Sergio's argument in terms of the crisis of the world economy, at least in the US economy. I would argue that COVID-19's timing could not be better from the perspective of those who advocate the current course that we're on. The US was experiencing its longest macroeconomic expansion. We've had nearly 2 years of U3 unemployment rates below 4%. We had record low unemployment rates for key subgroups like Latinx and African American workers. We've had several years, finally, of some private sector wage growth. And you can see almost a year ago, President Trump's State of the Union speech talking about the US economy. And as always, there's a bunch of lies with a bit of truth in the sense that it was, at some level, the economy was as good as, from a macroeconomic perspective, as we've seen in for a long time. But what's going on at the ground? So what this looks at is the U.S. household balance sheets. And first of all, it's from the Survey of Consumer Finances. And it asks people in the first column, how much do you need for an emergency? And so you can look at both in terms of wealth status and also race, how people reported in terms of median levels. It's next asked, how much money do you have in the bank? How much liquid funds do you have to meet these needs? And so you can look and see what percent of households had the emergency covered. And at least in terms of what people perceived of what they needed, less than half had the emergency covered. The next column over is basically a question about kin support. And to what extent could you get $3,000 from your family or friend network? And so again, you see that a sizable plurality of households were basically did not have adequate protection. And of course, this is going to have major impact on once the vaccine, if it works and it's extensively distributed, that it's going to have a major impact on the economy to be able to pull out of this, the current crisis that we're in. My research is focused on how households build wealth. And on the one hand, this looks like a fairly standard model where the key sources, either from family, household saving out of current income, or asset appreciation, are the key pathways. What is different about this particular model is it doesn't assume a level playing field. Instead, what it argues is that each of these pathways, households experience them in very, very different ways, depending on their level of wealth and certainly race and gender issues as well. So for example, obviously most households, about somewhere between 25% and 33% of households report that they either have received an inheritance or gift from family or expect to, so that most don't. But actually for people who come from low wealth families, oftentimes when they are successful, they are the recipients of requests from other family members who have either outlived their meager nest eggs or have experienced some bills. And so what happens is actually some households in the economy are actually don't necessarily get help, but oftentimes are having to provide help, which means it's harder for them to be able to get ahead. So each of these pathways basically allows for, once households are able to generate some wealth, it gets easier and easier for them to do so. So this wealth privilege model basically argues that wealth begets wealth, and it becomes easier as your wealth increases. What I'm going to focus on is the fourth category, which is the government support, what the government has done in terms of providing household wealth. And the federal government has a long history of doing this. What they're doing today is 12 tax deductions. And these are, many of these are tax deductions that we, for those of us who have some wealth, are quite familiar with. But each of these tax deductions either helps households save more or helps them increase their after-tax income, be able to retain more of their appreciation, their capital gains, or be able to pass on more of their unrealized capital gains to their heirs. And in that way are allowing households to build wealth. In addition, there are wealth taxes, which I will talk about just momentarily. So what I've done is develop some estimates of what are the level of these wealth programs, and then we'll also attach them to who's benefiting from them. So the main sources of the tax deductions are from the Joint Committee of Taxation, as well as the U.S. Treasury. Fortunately, the Budget Control Act of 1974 requires the government to come up with estimates of the lost revenues to our tax coffers that each of these tax deductions generates. Then what I will do is I will attach them to households based on their wealth that is revealed through the Survey of Consumer Finances, which is a triennial survey that's done. So by looking at just what's happened to these 12 tax deductions, you can see that over the last generation, they've more than doubled using real dollars. And so the main reason why they have more than doubled, in some cases, Congress has made them more generous. In some cases, Congress has actually restricted them a bit. But the main reason that they have doubled is because of the iterative process that I mentioned earlier. In most cases, these do not have any caps, so that the more wealth I have, the more capital gains that I'm able to realize, the more that I'm able to benefit from the capital gains exclusion. And so part of this is that we're just seeing the iterative cycle of wealth concentration. The other piece of this is that these are designed for people who already have wealth. So for example, several of the tax deductions basically reward home ownership. They don't help people own a home or get to home ownership. They help you once you've gained there. Several others, in terms of the pension and life insurance, basically help households that are building retirement savings. Again, most households, particularly low wealth households, need rainy day savings, the kind that would be helpful during this particular crisis. But these these tax deductions do not support that kind of saving. So these are really tied to help affluent households. The last thing, as tax deductions, that means that the higher the tax bracket you're in, the more value the tax deduction has. So for this reason, we see that they are largely able to benefit wealthier households. So again, what I do is I pair these tax deductions with households based on their current pension and life insurance funds, whether they have tax-exempt bonds, their capital gains, mortgage debt, etc. And this is based on recent research I have. In fact, I have a paper that'll be coming out in the review of Black political economy that talks a lot about these issues. What I've updated them for this paper is to include the 2019 survey, as well as some estimates of whether people itemized or not. Here's who's getting these tax deductions. And you can see that what I've done is look at the benefits that are going to those in the bottom quintile, those in the middle quintile, and those in the top quintile. And you can see that it's an escalating set of benefits that go to the very most affluent. They're the ones who are able to take the most advantage of this. Of course, since race is tied to wealth status because of our historic legacy, you can see that, again, these wealth policies largely benefit white households. What I do next is I want to fill in the gaps of each year. So the survey of consumer finances is done every 3 years. So what I do is I take the estimates of the preceding and the following year for each of the surveys in terms of household asset shares so that I can fill in the intervening years. Wealth doesn't change that much. I mean, the whole idea of wealth is to be impervious to change. So these asset shares, using that assumption, doesn't seem to be a big problem. So what that then allows me to do is to look at how much of these contributions are helping the wealthiest quintile. So that's the column on the far right. So over from 1989 to 2019, the most wealthiest quintiles have increased their wealth by $70 trillion. The wealthiest 20%. If we look at just how much help they got from the federal government from these tax deductions, it would only be about 14 million, or about 20%. So that's the far left. But what's happened is, what did these people do with this help? Well, presumably they invested it. So what I do in the middle 3 columns is to look at, well, what happens if households took this help and invested it at a 3%, a 6%, and a 9% rate of return. So we get in those 6 and 9%, somewhere between a third and over half of the wealth that has gone to the wealthiest is coming from these federal contributions. And for wealthy people, a 9% rate of return is not that outlandish. So what we see here again is that the tremendous benefits that this federal largesse is largely going to those who have already accumulated huge amounts. Of course, this creates a new problem, which is I want to be able to pass on some of this wealth, this accumulated wealth, to my heirs. Okay, and so what there has been over the last generation, again, is repeated attempts to eliminate the estate tax, to raise the threshold, and you can see here that what's happened in terms of what amount is able to pass through without taxation. So again, what we're seeing is that this is leading to a intergenerational transfer, a reproduction of this system into the future. So what I want to look at last year is this focus on the wealthy is not just class envy, okay? So This is looking at, well, what's happened to those at the 10th percentile and the 30th percentile over the last generation. All of this wealth has gone through to help families be able to get ahead. And presumably, the whole idea of these wealth policies ought to help families get to a certain threshold where they can then begin to really utilize the privileges of wealth, the benefits that come with having wealth and being able to grow more wealth. But what you can see here is that most these households are completely unprepared. They've gotten very little help from the federal government in terms of these programs, and we can see here that there's a sizable portion of households that are basically have no safety net in terms of dealing with the pandemic and all of the economic disruptions. Now, obviously, this is all intentional because consider the following. What would have happened over the last 8 or 9 months if households had the means to say, I'm not going to work? If the so-called essential workers basically said, I don't need to work. I can sit this one out because I have a nest egg to be able to do that. Okay. Thinking about this reminds me of that classic Herbert Gann's article where he writes about poverty and how we all benefit from poverty. So I think it's clear we have intentional policy. What can we do different? Well, we can certainly fully tax intergenerational transfers. We can curtail or cap the current tax deductions. We can talk about, in addition to the Green New Deal, a federal jobs guarantee, increased funding for Pell Grants, expansion of match savings programs in individual development accounts, expansion of first-time home buyer assistance, fully fund Darity and Hamilton's baby bonds proposals, and fund a reparations program. These are the things that we can do that would allow us to have to be able to future COVID-19s in terms of their impact, their harmful impact on so many households. With that, I'll stop, see if there's any questions, and listen to any comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. You did really well on time. So I will now discuss Bob's paper. And let me just set my clock here. Come on. Okay. So this, I really like this paper. I think it both provides an analysis and a policy direction that is really important and essential to changing the trajectory of our society, our country, our economy. I mean, these are things that, you know, those of us in the, you know, certainly in URPE have been well aware of these increasing disparities in wealth and, you know, in income, and particularly wealth that has been, you know, expanding certainly for the last 3 decades or so, you know, the great U-turn. But Bob, it goes into the details of policy, the details of tax policy, and the impacts in a way that I thought was extremely illuminating and important. And this is information that really should get out to our policymakers. You know, I don't know, you might want to send this to Heather and Jared. So they should be very interested in this. The paper notes the history of discrimination, and then it, as Bob pointed out in the presentation, the 13 key federal tax bills that are targeted. In the paper, he also talks a lot about the racial disparities here, and there was something of that in the presentation. But it you know, because of the close correlation between wealth and race in this country, it's really massively impacted our African American and Latinx brothers and sisters and families just enormously, and just made it impossible or very difficult for people to advance in our economy. So it's really kind of racial and class discrimination, structural discrimination that just perpetuates and gets worse and worse generation after generation. I think Bob's analysis makes that very clear in how the policies are actually, supporting that, facilitating that, making that more and more of a problem, rather than working in the other direction as they should be. As if we were really true to our supposed values of equal opportunity and equity in the economy. My major comments are just some of the details, and I expect this is, it's the conference paper, so Bob would probably be working on this a lot more as he develops this further. So the first half of the paper was I thought just excellent, just very well written, very very convincing and clear. The second part, some of the quantitative data, and Bob, I'll send you my little edits. If you find them useful. Just some of the graphs and some of the discussion there was kind of hard to follow and a little bit confusing in the end. One thing was for example, when you so I assume that what you're doing when you add the rates of return is you're looking at the year by year, and year by year support that the federal government is giving, and then compounding that for various different years. But it would be nice to just explain a little bit more your methodology, what's going on there. Similarly, when you say you're interpolating, it was clear in your presentations, oh, that's what you're doing. You're just taking the in-between years and sort of taking averages. I mean, so that's pretty clear. And I think, hard to dispute the methodology, but it would, again, it would be good to have a little more clarity on that. Oh, and then your last graph in the presentation, I think, did you mean 30%, 10% and 30%, or 10% and 90%? There might have been a typo in that last graph there. And on balance, I think this is really an excellent paper. It's sort of what radical political economy, I think, is all about. It's not just interpreting things, but to try and make them effective, make them important for policy and things that we can actually change, to try and look at how can we make this change the system to make it more equitable and fair, particularly well, by class and by race. And that was also a nice part of the paper, that you linked those things so closely. It made it very clear. So I think that's the the balance of my comments. And thank you, Bob. An excellent paper. So now we'll move on to Neil.
Oh, great. Thank you for including me on the panel. I'm going to sort of focus even closer on some policies associated with the Green New Deal, make some parallels with COVID-19 and as well as global climate change. Well, there we go. COVID-19 has made clear to all what public health professionals have long known, that the social determinants of health produce outcomes that belie individual choice. As the pandemic has made clear, health is a social product manifest in discrete cases. The home, the built environment, the neighborhood, and its infrastructure all participate in a production process, the outcomes of which we can recognize as ill health or perhaps wellness, even if what constitutes the production process are seldom seen as such. Among the definitional aspects of the Green New Deal is that it recognizes exactly this. The built environment, our homes, neighborhoods, infrastructure, etc., produce significant non-agenda. In the context of this essay, that means the built environment produces health outcomes. In the discussion of the Green New Deal, more generally, we recognize the built environment producing things like global climate change. To its credit, the Green New Deal is organized conceptually around the active reconstruction of the built environment through state initiatives, which do not have to meet a market test in terms of the timely capture of private returns. As we know, the rich and poor alike will be impacted. but the poor will be impacted more severely and have less recourse for adaptation. Together, this is a promise of the Green New Deal. Targeted programs to reconstruct the built environment in which the most environmentally disadvantaged communities also benefit the most. Success of the Green New Deal is predicated on building equity in exactly these communities. Stated another way, if the built environment is not reconstructed to produce better health outcomes in African American, Hispanic, and poor communities, the Green New Deal will have failed. The balance of this essay is focused on one particular area, Green New Deal programs targeted at the elimination of pediatric lead poisoning and the bundle of health outcomes which it creates. Lead is poisonous to humans at the subcellular level because the body confuses lead for calcium, which is used throughout every organ system. And yet we have managed to build lead into every landscape on the planet, from the deep ocean to Himalayan glaciers, to the Nebraska prairie, to suburban Boston. Consider the chickenpox diagram of Claire Patterson. The diagram is designed to illustrate the challenge of returning to natural baseline levels of lead exposure. The figure on the right, covered in dots, represents contemporary levels of lead exposure. The figure in the center represents 1/4 that level of lead exposure and is the standard cutoff for health interventions. The figure on the left illustrates historic levels of lead exposure, 100 times less lead than is represented by the figure in the center. I'd like to draw a parallel with greenhouse gas emissions and the difference between the current trends, the figure on the right, reductions in the production of atmospheric carbon and other greenhouse gases, figure in the center, and the active removal of carbon from the atmosphere, the figure on the left. One way to conceptualize the task at hand is the unbuilding of the Anthropocene. Lead is a useful element, and that usefulness engenders applications in everything from paint to fuel to children's toys to cosmetics to electronics of all sorts. And lead is a waste product that comes from smokestacks, e-waste, and particularly spent car batteries. To staunch its health risks, we need a systematic approach, and thus the Green New Deal programs. There we go. I group these programs into 3 overlapping agendas: legibility, infrastructure renewal, and research. The legibility agenda involves seeing the extent of the problem in an expansive and inclusive way, understanding through direct measure where lead is and where it isn't. State capacity in general is dependent on legibility programs. The United States Census, for example, is a legibility program. In the US, our county level COVID-19 response is dependent on the legibility of diagnoses, hospital admittance, ICU capacity, etc. Here in the United States, the National Health and Nutrition Survey, NHANES, has been assessing the health and nutritional status of Americans in a nationally representative sample periodically since 1971 and biannually since 1999. One intent of the programs I'll be discussing is to change the way the state interacts with its constituents and associate legibility with caring outcomes. I am from the government and I'm here to help, so to speak, with no irony implied. For legibility to be associated with caring outcomes depends on building equity, that is, successful infrastructure renewal programs, and ultimately better health outcomes. Infrastructure in this case should be understood in the expansive sense to cover, yes, water and power, but also educational infrastructure, the material content of our older homes, the ground we walk on, and the air we breathe. This is where the majority of the jobs will be created, the vectors by which the lived experience will be transformed, and the social determinants of health addressed. Finally, there are several research agendas which complement infrastructure renewal and follow from the legibility agenda. Replacing lead, useful material in its industrial applications, will require basic research, while the remedial processes used to remove lead from the built environment can also benefit from comprehensive research attention. Can we do it? Can we staunch the risks of lead exposure? On some level, I know we can because we have done it before. In 1980, in a report prepared for the National Academy of Sciences, Claire Patterson wrote this: sometime in the near future, it probably will be shown that older urban areas of the United States have been rendered more or less uninhabitable by the millions of tons of poisonous industrial lead residues that have accumulated in cities during the past century. The veracity of his statement, now 40 years past, can thankfully be judged as incorrect. At the time, however, his warning was spot on. N. Haynes, too, completed the same year his warning was published, reported that the geometric mean blood lead level of children in the United States was 15 micrograms per deciliter. But by 2015, the geometric mean of childhood blood level had fallen to under 1 microgram per deciliter. A tremendous success enabled not by the manipulation of the price mechanism, but by environmental legislation that effectively prohibits the use of lead in paint, gasoline, and plumbing products, as well as regulations that place limits on lead emissions into the atmosphere. By prohibiting the use of lead in industrial applications and the continued production of a lead-loaded environment, this raft of environmental policies does double duty as health policy. We need look no farther for examples of a state creating caring outcomes. But we must temper any optimism with uncomfortable facts. You can't honestly talk about lead poisoning without talking about race and class. The national mean observes significant disparities in the experience of these caring outcomes. For example, when disaggregated by race, it is clear that throughout the N. Haynes era, at least the last 50 years, African Americans as a group have experienced blood lead levels significantly higher than either the national average or that of any other racial or ethnic group. Meanwhile, the production of lead-loaded environments continues. The examples of Flint, Michigan, and the Exide recycling facility in East Los Angeles testify to that. It is poor and minority neighborhoods where the improvements are slowest and new hazards continue to emerge. It is hard to interpret being the most impacted and the least benefited as expressions of care. Thus, we focus on getting pediatric blood lead levels to zero. It is the unequal distribution of lead in the built environment that must be targeted first. Along these lines, I'm going to introduce several programs intended to build equity while eliminating lead poisoning. And I don't spend much time discussing these programs in terms of cost benefits, though other people have. For instance, David Jones in 2012 reported a lower bound estimate for the benefits associated with lead poisoning derived from increased expected lifetime earnings and reduced medical expenditures as 2 to 20 times the estimated cost of remediations. The Minnesota Department of Health has more recently estimated that spending $4 billion to eliminate lead in drinking water would yield $8 billion in social benefits from avoiding cognitive impairments, in particular, lower lifetime earnings associated with lower IQ. I'm not confident in my ability to articulate it, but I think the ethical case for eliminating lead poisoning is stronger than the case made in monetary terms. And the ethical case turns on what the production of lead-poisoned children entails. And that's the involuntary alteration of a child's physical integrity, the effect of which is cognitive impairment, brain damage, and other bad health outcomes too numerous to report. But turning to the Green New Deal and beginning with legibility. Though the mean pediatric blood lead levels have fallen precipitously, we are still experiencing an epidemic of lead poisoning. The average child surveyed by N. Haynes 2 would be considered severely lead poisoned today. And that same child has recently passed into their fourth decade of lead poisoned life. By way of an evocative comparison, those areas of Flint, Michigan that experienced the greatest frequency of lead poisoning saw 11% of the children with blood lead levels greater than 5 micrograms per deciliter. N. Haynes 2 reported that 88% of all children in the US in the late 70s had blood lead levels greater than 10 micrograms per deciliter. This is a fact that we haven't, as a country, come to grips with. Recently, Michigan Governor Whitner began the process of bringing some restorative justice to the victims of lead poisoning in Flint, approving the creation of a $641 million fund 80% of which is to be allocated to individuals who were still minors at the time of the lead contamination there. No such program exists for the victims of tetraethyl leaded gasoline or leaded paint. The closest that I know of is a tax on gasoline and paint to pay for some lead testing. A first step for the adult survivors of lead poisoning would be an acknowledgement of the injustice that occurred, and then a thorough documentation of the extent of the issue through the analysis, perhaps, of lead content in trabecular bone or deciduous teeth. Meanwhile, there's the task of thinking through what restorative justice would look like to those subjected to this biological disinvestment process. Perhaps it's a jobs program that prioritizes lead victims for dignified employment. We do not currently understand the extent of pediatric lead poisoning. Only 10 states, plus the District of Columbia, have universal screening requirements for children under 5. Compliance with these requirements runs as low as 68%. 8 states have targeted programs that require children with an economic or geographic risk factor to be tested for lead. Compliance with this ordinance means that as few as 8% of children are tested for lead. 27 states require or recommend testing on the basis of a risk assessment, and testing rates there run as low as 1%. 5 states have no official screening recommendations and provide no information about the percentage of children tested. Additionally, rules for reporting and recording test results differ from state to state, with many states only requiring reporting above thresholds, which change from state to state. As we know from the coronavirus pandemic, there's a tremendous value to testing the asymptomatic. And the effects of lead poisoning, like COVID-19, are often not apparent, though the individual is stricken. Universal testing is Universal testing is more useful than targeted testing. It also produces better understandings of the geography and enables the identification of unexpected risk factors. And it is more cost-effective than targeted testing. Additionally, the potential exists in universal testing to align the interests of the rich and poor, because there is no safe level of pediatric blood lead exposure. If the affluent see their lot is cast in with the poor, perhaps they will be motivated to do more. The soil has been discussed as a repository for lead waste since at least the early 70s, and understood in the medical literature as an important pathway for human lead exposure since the mid-90s. Certainly, this is true for soil in brownfields and Superfund sites, but current epidemiological models exist that connect soil lead levels in residential neighborhoods with elevated blood lead levels in children who live there. However, extensive documentation of neighborhood soil lead levels does not exist. Soil lead testing, complements universal blood lead testing, but these legibility programs are of little value on their own. Legibility, qua legibility, is not a worthwhile goal. Only where systematic observations are put into use in the identification of unexpected causes or clusters of lead poisoning and guided health interventions is legibility associated with caring. Legibility enables the government to target areas of most pressing concern and guide infrastructure renewal programs that in addition to reconstructing the built environment, embody potentially hundreds of thousands of decent, well-paid equity building jobs. A diagnosis of pediatric lead poisoning need not be a life sentence. Billings and Schneppel illustrate the lead and educational interventions following a diagnosis of elevated blood lead can produce large long-term benefits. The set of treatments in the Carolina Abecedarian Project, which focus on social, emotional, and cognitive assistance for young children, has been associated with increases in educational attainment, reductions in criminal activity, and improved adult health. Providing this support is labor-intensive work. However, this good work underscores that a child's possibilities are not foreclosed upon diagnosis. The effect of removing lead from the built environment, the effectiveness of removing lead from the built environment on lowering blood lead levels is supported by decades of research. This fall, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development announced $165 million in funding for lead-based paint hazard reduction grants to remove lead from over 7,000 housing units nationwide. David Jones in 2012 found that each remediated home prevents about 2.5 cases of lead poisoning. This excellent work, ongoing now since 1995, has prevented an estimated 500,000 cases of lead poisoning. However, the scale of the work that remains to be done is staggering. In 2011, the American Healthy Homes Survey reported that there were over 23 million homes in the United States with one or more lead-based paint hazard. Not to be discouraged, and underscoring the thesis of this essay, the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Pediatrics both recommend housing-based interventions to stop the production of ill health, moving the treatment of chronic disease upstream, removing the cause to prevent the injury. Water is an efficient medium for pediatric lead exposure. We shouldn't neglect the importance of pipes below the ground just because we can't see them. Lead service lines were banned in new construction in 1985. And just this year, the EPA revised its lead and copper rule for the first time since 1991. This revised rule is designed to more reliably identify elevated lead levels in the nation's 68,000 public water systems and compel water utilities to replace their portion of a lead service line anytime a resident decides to replace a lead pipe leading to their home. However, the new rule extends the time for replacing pipes with high levels of contamination to 33 years. That said, some states have set their own targets. For instance, Minnesota is going to try to do this in 20 years at an upper bound cost of $365 billion. And they estimate the benefit of that activity to be $2.11 billion. Estimating the benefits produced in these infrastructure renewal programs is one research agenda among many. And the Green New Deal will have to employ scientists to carry out basic research if it is to achieve its goals, whether the goal be arresting climate change or staunching pediatric lead poisoning. Soil is critical, if under-discussed, aspect of the built environment, and its remediation is necessary to generate better health outcomes. That said, our soil remediation methods are extremely crude. The standard method is to dig up contaminated soil and haul it to a landfill. The second standard practice is to encapsulate the soil with a layer of clean fill, sod, or new planting. We can do better. Then there's lead-safe recycling. We're using more lead than ever. Lead is easily recyclable, but it's an extremely hazardous process, and it's being exported. And in that export, the people engaged in that activity are entering into a disinvestment process. It's important to increase the amount of oversight of consumer products. Despite our strict rules against producing products like that here in the US, we continue to import lead-loaded consumer products. And the oversight of this has been one of the fatalities of COVID-19. On March 19th, we stopped intercepting on any level. I'm going to close with these last two. The first is alternative battery technology, which gets a lot of conversation in regular Green New Deal discussions, so I'll leave that to the side. The final one is adequate nutrition for children. And though it's a stretch as a Green New Deal program, perhaps using nutritional assistance to combat lead poisoning may be an effective strategy to bridge what is likely a decades-long project of reconstructing a lead-free built environment. Malnourished children are an affront to our dignity as humans, no less than lead poisoning is. That it may be possible to address both indignities simultaneously is all the more reason to expand the influence of the caring state, building equity through Green New Deal programs focused on eliminating lead poisoning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. And we'll now go to Sergio, who's going to comment on Neil's paper.
Thank you. Yeah, I like the paper. First, I like that the problematic of lead poisoning is very well presented. It's rather quite a global situation in the US at least, but is much less known than the COVID-19 crisis or whatever. It's like a kind of I don't know, low profile health problem if compared with the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think, I mean, I've heard before about the situation in Flint, Michigan, but I didn't know that it was such a broad issue in the whole United States. The Russell and dimension of the problematic is well presented too, and I like it too. I think it's like I argued about the COVID-19 pandemic. It's also a problematic that capitalism hasn't been able to address properly and to solve. I think that the relation between this problematic and the new Green Deal is it's straightforward and it's quite important. As Neil said, if the new Green Deal doesn't address this issue and doesn't properly mitigate the consequence of the lead poisoning, then the new Green Deal will have failed, at least in this topic. And I think this is a very important point. And to relate both things, the lead poisoning problematic and the new Green Deal, I think it's a nice thing to do. Especially if, I don't know, some kind of new Green Deal is expected to be implemented in the near future with the new government. I'm not very optimistic, but maybe there are pressures in order to have at least some pieces, some small pieces of new Green Deal, some still things. What I could change in the paper, or maybe the emphasis on the paper, is why this problematic hasn't been addressed in the US by now. Because as you argued, it doesn't seem to be a monetary issue, or in monetary terms doesn't seem to be the issue, because these measures could lead to save money in the end. So then why it hasn't been addressed? And I think that, I don't know, but I think that one reason could be that it is because it's not in the political agenda of not the political powers, not the parties, not the I don't know, the legislative power or whatever, but it's not in the political agenda of people itself. Maybe people are not aware of the issue or of the problematic of lead poisoning in their communities. As you said, maybe if rich people were more aware of the problematic of lead poisoning in themselves, they would be more keen to be supportive of the problematic of the poor communities that are hit the hardest by this situation. And I think that the issue of legibility there, I think it is very important to analyze and to have a measure of the problem. But I think here that it's not, I mean, in order to have a more tangible policy or more, or I don't know, a strategy in order to get this done, I think that the legibility should be first addressed. The problem of the legibility should be first addressed by community-based, not the state, but by community-based organizations that make people aware of what is the situation. So this situation is part of the political awareness of the people, and then the relationship with the new Green Deal could be then inversed. So the Green Deal doesn't solve the problem, but the problem does push for the new Green Deal, and I think it will be a nice turn of the situation. And congratulations for your presentation and paper.
Thank you, Sergio. If folks who are listening want to submit questions, I think we have about 18 minutes for Q&A. Let me look at the chat here. Okay, so I have, I'll just go in the order. One question from Robert. Ron, do we need to phase out the fossil fuel industry? That's a good question. I think we do ultimately. You know, we need to move to renewable fuels for sure. But there's a transition period where I think it's you know, we really can't. The problem is, even as we're building lots of renewables, we still keep increasing our energy use, and the developing countries need to increase much more faster, more rapidly, because that's part of economic development, is to use more energy, and that's the most you know, the easiest and most abundant source right now. So I think what we need to do, in fact, the global thermostat, you know, when you have they have the system where when you have a natural gas fired generator and you put in a point source carbon removal system, you actually have negative emissions. By using natural gas, you're using the heat from that to remove carbon. You remove more carbon than the natural gas is putting in. And likewise, Lackner has done calculations at $100 a ton removal, which is very feasible. In fact, some people are claiming they're already there or below that. The extra price to remove the carbon from a gallon of gas, for example, is on the order of, I think it was 50 cents to $1 per gallon. So we could we probably will have to keep using fossil fuels, particularly in developing countries. We need to find a way to offset that, to remove that, and get to negative and remove more and more as we transition to more and more sustainable energy and synthetic fuels that can actually use the same infrastructure in many ways. You use the carbon with hydrogen, you produce synthetic fuels. If you can make that efficient, you can use that instead of fossil fuels. So that's a long answer to that question, but it's a good question. I think the focus on just, you know, getting rid of fossil fuels right now is a little bit misplaced, as Bob pointed out in his comments. You know, I don't think it's really helpful. We need to use that infrastructure to move forward and recognize that we have a transition period, and we can deal with that if we do this right. Okay, next question. Sorry, from Thomas. Bob, does your net worth include vehicles? If so, taking them out means even the 30th percentile's median net worth is probably negative. That probably relates to that issue of whether that 30% was supposed to be 90%. Graph there, the last graph, which you can also maybe address. So Bob, if you want to take that.
Hi, Tom. Yes, it does. At least as far as I remember, I took vehicles out. And I do think I meant that to be the 30%. I was trying to get at sort of where low wealth households were standing. I think your point, though, is, as I'm thinking about it, is that, you know, what it still includes is retirement funds. And so again, if people are forced to withdraw from their retirement funds to sort of deal with the current level of prices, obviously there's some significant penalties to that. And so I'm thinking that maybe if I can take a different measure, which would be just looking at more liquid funds, that would give a better sense of the level of preparation or ill preparation that graph's trying to get at. So I think it's I appreciate the point in terms of thinking about how to get at it in an even better way. But thanks.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? If folks want to add more questions, in the meantime, I think we can all go around and just maybe respond to some of the comments that the commentators have made. I'll just say quickly in passing that I really appreciate Bob's point about the purity issue. It's very controversial on the left, so I'm trying to be as careful as I can, because I fully support the Green New Deal. Obviously, this is not what I'm proposing is not a substitute, but it is a change in framing. And let me just add that, and I made the point already, that if you have ambient air capture ability at say $100 a ton or lower, that creates an upper bound. You have to pay that $100 unless you can get your carbon out. So it puts pressure actually on the fossil fuel industry and all the big carbon emitters, saying you got to stop, putting this off and making excuses. If you can't do it, we'll just have you pay somebody else to do it at $100. So it puts an upper bound and forces the folks who can probably get it out more quickly because they have a point source concentrated source more efficiently to do that right away and keep pushing that down. So it's actually complementary and supportive. And also those things can be built anywhere. You could build those things, frontline communities. There are some issues in Lackner's thing about dryness and heat and, to have renewable energy and so forth. But the various versions of that can be built anywhere on the globe, anywhere. So you could actually place those in places that need employment, that need, put them where the fossil fuel people are being laid off. They have, so it's a very, I think it's a good way to go. I'll move to our next presenter was Sergio.
Yes, I have a couple of comments and questions in the chat. I answered them in writing, but I mean, yeah, writing, but yeah, the first comment was that COVID is actually not the first pandemic since the Spanish influenza, and we have another like the Ebola pandemic. And so what I meant there is that it was the first pandemic that has created global situation of catastrophic mortality that has affected the majority of countries in the world. And of course, we have had another epidemics like the Ebola or the SARS or whatever, but I think we haven't learned much about them, and they were different also. But and the other comment was about the consequences of the. I mean, the comment was, do you see the cyclical recovery from being enough to overcome the structural crisis? Can the major economies bounce back to the previous growth trends? And my answer was no. I think the crisis will have profound and enduring effects. It will deteriorate the weak structural context that already existed prior to the crisis. National economies will take long to recover the previous levels of economic activity. Of course, it will depend on some countries and geographical regions, but it will be hard. Sorry, it's in the yeah, the new growth rates will be lower than it would have been if the COVID had not happened. These were my answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. Are there any, so Bob would be next to comments, but I'm curious, I can't see my chat. So if there are questions in the chat that.
Sorry, it was not the chat, it was
Oh,
the
okay.
yeah, because I have it in Spanish, so I don't know.
Okay, okay, I got you. Okay, I was afraid I missed something.
Questions and answers, yeah, or something like that, yeah.
Excellent,
Sorry.
okay. Yeah, so Bob, take it away. We have about 9 minutes, so I don't see any more Q&As from the audience here.
Ron, I appreciate your generous comments. I think the main things that you were encouraging me to do was to follow up in terms of more explanation in terms of the methodology and the interpolation issue, which I, thank you. I mean, I appreciate that. And so I appreciate, you're taking a look at it and giving me this feedback. So thanks.
Yeah, I will send you some of that stuff. Yeah.
Great. That would be great.
If it's take it.
It's always helpful.
Double. Yeah. Okay, great. Neil, do you want to make some?
Yeah, just sort of, I don't know if the question was meant to be ironic or not when you're asking sort of like, well, it looks like these lead remediation programs yield great benefits, why aren't we doing them? And the answer is race and class, right? That lead poisoning is a racialized problem. That's the problem of African Americans in the city, not here in the suburbs, so we don't need to do anything about it, right? And that's the way it's always been, right? That the problem was first identified systematically in the 1960s by community activists, right? And that the most effective anti-lead poisoning measures were accidental byproducts of the Clean Air Act, right? Part of the Clean Air Act was putting catalytic converters in cars, and leaded gasoline destroys catalytic converters. So they outlawed lead gasoline, right? They didn't do it because they thought lead gasoline was poisoning kids. They did it because leaded gasoline was producing smog in Southern California, and that the nice people that live there didn't want to live in a smoggy city. The thing that I want to emphasize is that it did not go through the price mechanism, and it was extremely effective. So, there you go. Your other point about community-based legibility programs is extremely well taken. I think that's a really, a better way of framing it. Talking about the Green New Deal as a top-down government initiative is a mistake, perhaps, right? That in the same way that we can frame the Green New Deal as something that is involved in rebuilding the world, right? Reconstructing the built environment, we don't need to frame it as being, the government comes in and spends a bunch of money and saves us all, right? It's something that we all do together, and will be more effective if it's based at the community level, right? And then perhaps something like the Sunrise Movement is a good inspiration on that level.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Anyone else have more comments? I mean, I could say some things. We have about 5 minutes. Any questions from the audience? I still see the same two there. So does anybody want to add some further comments? If not, I'll just on the price mechanism. There are two things that I think are kind of intersections of a lot of the points we've been making on the price issue. In terms of the climate change, Robin Hale has done a lot of work on this relative to the Kyoto mechanism, and I think a lot of that can be transferred to the Paris Article 6 version of the same thing, the cap and trade idea. It actually would be extremely beneficial. I think if you look at the analysis, it would be particularly beneficial to developing countries because they would have higher caps. They would have more time to reduce or get to carbon negative. and they could utilize the transfers by having processes in their countries to draw it down, offsetting certificates. So the issue of the bogus offsetting certificates, as I said, if you had national governments responsible for getting to certain levels, it doesn't matter whether the certificates are bogus or not, they still have to get to those levels. So people that are cheating and selling bogus certificates would just be robbing their fellow citizens of carbon emissions room. Well, I would want it to be negative. I think we had to get to zero right away and get to negative right away. But that's, so I think the critique on the left of these kind of market mechanisms, I think is misplaced, and I think Robin does a good job. Who actually has been a very strong, as many of you know, anti-market guy. So I think it's particularly worthwhile listening to his critique because he's very aware of the downsides of markets as he makes that. On one other issue on the, we could, we want to have dual use here. So as we're dealing with lead poisoning, as we're dealing with wealth inequality, as we'll be dealing with, capitalist failures, cyclical and structural failures, we obviously, we can combine this stuff. We can do the new economy, the renewable energy and materials economy. You want to build that to address all these inequalities as you're addressing climate change. So of course, that is, I think, the goal that we're all shooting for. And as I said, in some ways, the air capture makes that easier because you can put that anywhere, any place. And the globe is one giant dump site. It's the atmosphere and the oceans that we got to get the stuff out of. We can do that anywhere, literally. There's a little bit of a lag between the northern and southern hemisphere, but I think it's a few years. But other than that, wherever we do it, will be good. And the Arctic sea ice triage, I think, would affect everyone certainly in the stratospheric injection version of that. Okay, 2 more minutes. Anybody want to add something? Okay, well, thank you all. I think it's been a really good panel and really interesting. I really enjoyed, going over these papers and listening to the talks. And hopefully we will get through the winter and get to a better place in the spring and move on from there and address some of these other problems. Or we'll have another pandemic, right, if we keep on the current course. Thank you. Thank you all.
Goodbye, all.
Thank
Thanks,
you to
Ron.
you.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Hopefully next year we'll be in person.
Yes, absolutely.
Nice to see you here, and thank you very much.
Yes, Sergio is a colleague of mine
Bye.
on the RP Ed board. So yeah, bye guys.